Thank you. Thank you for coming. In 1818, John Adams, looking back on 1776, recalled how 13 clocks were made to strike together. He was referring to how in 1776, the 13 colonies united to together seize independence. Today, in an era when we are very much divided, we tend to long for that time when we were all united. What I hope to talk about today, is to say that that era never really existed, that the unity of 1776, if it existed at all, was very fleeting. The founders were just as apt to disagree with each other as any Republicans or Democrats today, and their disagreements were just as heated as any we have today. Sometimes their feuds were personal and sometimes petty. Sometimes they were driven by ideological differences. And it's no wonder that they feuded. What they felt, what they believed, was that what was at stake was not just the nature of the republic, but the very survival of our nation. I think one way to introduce you to the nature of the founding feuds is to tell you, to quote some of the lines they used to insult each other. This is John Adams on Arthur Lee from Massachusetts. Well, Adams was from Massachusetts. Lee was, of course, from Virginia. His countenance is disgusting. His air is not pleasing. His manners are not engaging. His temper is harsh, sour, and fiery. This is Abigail Adams on Alexander Hamilton. I have read his heart in his wicked eyes many a time. The very devil is in them. This is Thomas Jefferson describing Hamilton as a man whose history, from the moment at which history can stoop to notice him, is a tissue of machinations against the liberty of the country which has not only received and given him bread, but heaped its honors on his head. And this is Hamilton describing Adams as a man whose vanity is without bounds and a jealousy capable of discoloring every object. Mercy Otis Warren, who is one of the first historians of the Revolutionary period, she wrote a 1,300-page history on the Revolution, which very much annoyed Adams partly because he only had 4 pages in it, and this was a man who had an ego, partly because it was what she said. But he then wrote literally hundreds of pages to her attacking her history, which she described as the ravings of a lunatic. Adams' response to Warren was, history is not the province of ladies. George Washington generally tried to stay above the fray and usually succeeded. He was the one founding father who no one felt they could attack, at least publicly. But not Thomas Paine. This is Thomas Paine writing to George Washington. As to you, sir, treacherous in private friendship, for so you have been to me, and a hypocrite in public life, the world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any. And finally, one more. This is Thomas Jefferson writing to his friend. They were actually friendships, not just feuds. This is Thomas Jefferson writing to his friend and ally, James Madison, on Patrick Henry. What we have to do, I think, Jefferson wrote, is devoutly to pray for his death. But in talking about these feuds, the founders were so eloquent that even their insults are just worth reading. But what I hope to suggest here is that we have something more to get from this, that we have something more to learn from them, that perhaps we can learn that divisions, even our divisions today as a nation, are not a cause for despair. After all, democracy depends on people disagreeing. If everybody agreed, it would not be a democracy. And I also think the founders showed us some ways in which we might be able to get beyond our own divisions today. I mean, after all, the founders created a nation despite, and I would argue maybe even because, of their feuds. I'd like to start, if I can, yes. I'd like to start with two people who, and this is not just because I am an employee of Colonial Williamsburg and feel obligated to show you people who you can see if you go a few miles down the road and visit the historic area of Colonial Williamsburg. I'd like to start with the feud between Patrick Henry and James Madison. Henry was the Revolution's greatest orator. This is the man who said in Williamsburg at the Capitol, "If this be treason, make the most of it." Madison was the father of our Constitution, and when they debated, it was with the future of that document at stake. They faced off in Virginia at the Virginia Ratifying Convention of 1788. 9 states, for the Constitution to become law, 9 states had to ratify it. At this point, 8 had done so. So the Virginia Ratifying Convention was the last stand for the anti-federalists, those who were against the Constitution. Henry was the leading anti-federalist. Madison was the leading federalist. The historian Joseph Ellis said that theirs was the most consequential debate in American history, more so even than the Lincoln-Douglas debate over slavery. Henry and Madison had faced off before 1788. They had disagreed over the relationship between church and state. Henry had pushed for a law that people should pay taxes to support a church of their choice, which was a step toward religious freedom. It was saying, you could support a church other than the established church. But Jefferson and Madison wanted a fuller separation of church and state. Jefferson said of Henry, "He is all tongue without either head or heart." But back to the ratification fight. Originally, the Federalists had wanted Henry to join them in Philadelphia to draw up the at the convention there to draw up the new Constitution. But Henry declined to go to Philadelphia. He said, "I smelt a rat." And at the ratifying convention in Virginia, he attacked that rat with a vengeance. When Henry spoke, he was long, and he was loud, and he was eloquent. Over 3.5 weeks of debate, nearly a quarter of the time debating was Henry speaking. Henry challenged the basic premises of the Constitution. He said, why should it be we the people? Why shouldn't it be we the states? He feared the power of a federal government, much as some do today. Madison, in contrast, was very quiet. In fact, at one point, the stenographer complained that he couldn't hear what Madison was saying. But Madison was systematic and logical, and he argued that the checks and balances in the Constitution would limit abuses of power by the federal government or any branch of the federal government. Henry's final speech was a classic Henry extravaganza. This is Henry speaking, he referring to Madison, he tells you of important blessings which he imagines will result to us and mankind in general from the adoption of this system. I see the awful immensity of the dangers with which it is pregnant. I see it, I feel it, I see beings of a higher order anxious concerning our decision. When I see beyond the horizon that binds human eyes and look at the final consummation of all human things and see those intelligent beings which inhabit the ethereal mansions reviewing the political decisions and revolutions which in the progress of time will happen in America and the consequent happiness or misery of mankind, I am led to believe that much of the account on one side or the other will depend on what we now decide. At this point, thunder interrupted this Henry's speech. And one delegate to the convention described how Henry, rising on the wings of the tempest to seize upon the artillery of heaven and direct its fiercest thunders against the heads of his adversaries. Well, the artillery of heaven was not enough. The convention did ratify the Constitution. But Henry did gain some measure of revenge. He managed, though he didn't have the power to stop the Constitution, he did have enough influence to deny Madison the Senate seat that he had hoped for, and almost denied him the House seat. Madison had to run for the House against James Monroe, which just a piece of trivia, was the first and the last time that two future presidents ran against each other for the House of Representatives. There is a twist to this story, though, an ironic twist and maybe a hopeful twist. Henry did ultimately become reconciled to the new Constitution. Partly this was because Madison pushed through a Bill of Rights, which guaranteed freedom of religion, of speech, of press, of assembly. And the irony is Madison, meanwhile, ended up embracing many of Henry's arguments. When he founded with Jefferson the Republican Party, it was based on the philosophy of objecting to the power of the federal government. So perhaps one of the lessons we can learn from the Henry-Madison feud is that positions that seem irreconcilable at one point aren't always. Next, I would like to talk about the feud between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. This is Bill Barker, who until very recently portrayed Thomas Jefferson at Colonial Williamsburg. Colonial Williamsburg does not have an Alexander Hamilton, though we like to sometimes pretend that absolutely everything of significance happened in Virginia. Every now and then we have to admit that there are some founding fathers who lived elsewhere. At the time, perhaps the best way to introduce the feud between Hamilton and Jefferson is by describing a dinner party that Jefferson hosted. And the description of this dinner party also comes from Jefferson. At the time, Jefferson was the Secretary of State in the Washington administration. Hamilton was the Treasury Secretary. Hamilton looked at some portraits on Jefferson's wall and asked who they were. And they were of Francis Bacon, of Isaac Newton, and of John Locke. And Jefferson answered Hamilton that these were the greatest men the world ever produced. Hamilton's response, according to Jefferson, was that the greatest man ever was Julius Caesar. The moral of the story to Jefferson was clear, that Hamilton was a would-be Caesar who would replace the republic, if he could, with a tyranny. Now, Hamilton was equally critical of Jefferson. He thought he was a hypocrite, a man who talked about liberty while owning slaves. He thought he was a naive philosopher who was seduced by the radical ideas of the French Revolution, and he thought that these radical ideas would ultimately lead to tyranny. And he thought Jefferson was a coward who had fled Monticello when British troops approached. This last one was true but unfair. I mean, Jefferson did flee. Jefferson's flight was prudent, but I mean, it wasn't heroic. What they really disagreed over, though, they had very different economic visions for America. Hamilton believed the economy ought to be centered on manufacturing and trade and centered, therefore, in the northern states. Jefferson envisioned an agrarian republic, much as he envisioned surrounding himself at Monticello. Hamilton believed in a strong federal government, higher taxes, a central bank. Jefferson thought all of these were steps on the road to tyranny. They were able sometimes to compromise. In 1790, their most famous compromise was in 1790, and this took place at another dinner party, where the deal they made was Hamilton would get the increased federal taxes that he wanted, and Jefferson would get the capital, not in Philadelphia or New York, but not so far from Mount Vernon in Virginia. But mostly, this compromise aside, mostly they were at odds. Jefferson described them as daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks. Washington tried to moderate, but mostly he failed, and mostly he sided with Hamilton. In 1793, Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State and became leader of America's first opposition party. So who won this feud? Well, in a sense, it was Jefferson. I mean, it was Jefferson, not Hamilton, who was elected president. It was Jefferson who succeeded in making America more democratic than anyone could have imagined, not yet for African Americans or women, but still, his words would inspire Americans to become more democratic. And it's Jefferson, of course, not Hamilton, who has the monument on the Mall. What did Hamilton get? Well, he got the musical. But in addition to that, the America that we have today, in urban America, in industrial America, in expansive America, a powerful America, this was very much Hamilton's vision for the country. But I would argue both won, in some sense. The 1800 election, when Jefferson became president, was a peaceful transfer of power. And Jefferson did not do what the Federalists and Hamilton feared. He did not turn the American Revolution into the French Revolution. He did not dismantle the federal government. Indeed, his inaugural address was very conciliatory. He said, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." And maybe that's a hopeful note for today. Maybe it would be nice if we occasionally thought we are all Democrats, we are all Republicans. Next, Jefferson and Adams. Well, this is actually Kurt Smith is the man who now plays Jefferson in Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg. We don't have an Adams either. Adams and Jefferson, before they feuded, they were great friends and allies. In 1776, they both were key to gaining independence. Adams fought so hard for independence at the Continental Congress that he admitted that, and this is his word, he admitted that his fellow delegates thought of him as obnoxious. And Jefferson was, of course, more eloquent than anyone could be in the Declaration of Independence. Together, they did more for the Revolution than anyone, well, I mean, maybe except for Washington or Franklin. And they were not just allies, they were great personal friends. The widow Jefferson spent much of his time at the home of John and Abigail. Jefferson wrote to his friend Madison that, yes, Adams was irritating, but he said, "You will love him if you get to know him." What tore this friendship apart were the politics of the Washington administration. Adams believed in the need for a strong executive. Jefferson thought that was too much like a king, a fear shared by many. After all, it was not so long ago that they had fought a revolution against a king. This culminated in a silly fight over what the president should be called. Adams believed the president should be called His Highness. Jefferson described that as, quote, "the most superlatively ridiculous thing I've ever heard of," unquote. And he also quoted Franklin on Adams as saying, "He is always an honest man, often a great one, but sometimes absolutely mad. Their feud got worse. Well, their feud got worse when they ran against each other for president in the election of 1796, which Adams won, and then even worse during the Adams administration during what was called the quasi-war with France, which was basically a series of naval engagements. The Federalists were worried about, well, they pointed to the excesses of the French Revolution and they pushed for war against France. Adams went so far as approving an army, building an army, and he appointed Hamilton to run that army, even though he despised Hamilton. You should not assume that the enemy of one's enemy is one's friends back then, or now. But he appointed Hamilton to run that army. The Republicans in Jefferson were much more sympathetic to the French. They remembered that the French were our allies during the Revolution, and they saw the French Revolution as a continuation of the American Revolution. And they saw Federalists as basically undemocratic, which they felt was confirmed when Federalists pushed through the Sedition Act of 1798, which was used to prosecute newspaper editors who criticized the government. Jefferson warned that this act was the first step toward creating a president for life. And then things got even worse with the election of 1800, a rematch between Adams and Jefferson. Adams, according to the Republicans, was a warmonger. He was a tyrant. Jefferson, according to the Federalists, was an anarchist. He was an atheist. But over the previous 4 years, the Republicans had gained ground with the public at large. The Federalists were more seen as wealthy aristocrats, and Jefferson won in 1800. He referred to the election of 1800, Jefferson, referred to it as the Revolution of 1800 because he believed it was as much a victory for democracy as the Revolution of 1776 had been. As for what Adams thought of the election results, you can judge by the fact that on the morning of Jefferson's inauguration, he boarded the 4 a.m. stage out of Washington, and he never returned. Here too, though, there's a happy turn and perhaps a hopeful lesson. In 1812, Adams sent a New Year's greeting to Jefferson, and Jefferson responded warmly, and this unleashed a flood of letters between the two. 158 letters between them between 1812 and their deaths on July 4th, 1826, and it's one of the most amazing stories. You know, even though you've heard it before, I can't resist saying again, it's just so amazing that they both died on the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. But anyway, in their letters, well, Adams wrote to Jefferson, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." And explain themselves they did, not just to each other, but to us. They talked about philosophy, they talked about politics, as if their differences were never personal. Jefferson wrote to Adams, "We do not think exactly alike. It matters little to our country which we have delivered to our successors." Well, he was right that they had delivered the country to their successors, but I would argue he was wrong that it doesn't matter. Their letters, their friendship their letters are a testament to their friendship and to their feuds and to their ability to together forge our nation. Next, I wanted to turn to two somewhat more obscure figures, William Cobbett and Thomas Paine. Well, Paine's not that obscure. Paine arrived in America from England with little more in his pocket than a letter from Benjamin Franklin recommending him. And within a few years, he had written Common Sense and American Crisis. These were essays which are credited with inspiring Americans to, in Paine's words, to begin the world over again. This new world, however, was too radical for most Americans. Paine supported the French Revolution, which certainly worried many Americans, but worse, he attacked organized religion, and he also attacked George Washington, calling him, as I said earlier, a traitor and a hypocrite. John Adams said of Paine that he was begotten by a wild boar on a bitch wolf. He also said, never before, in any age of the world, had there been such a career of mischief. Now you would think, as insults go, this would be hard to top. But here is William Cobbett writing in an antidote for Tom Paine's theological and religious poison. How Tom gets a living now, or what brothel he inhabits, I know not. Whether his carcass is at last to be suffered to rot on the earth or to be dried in the air is of very little consequence. Like Judas, he will be remembered by posterity. Men will learn to express all that is base, malignant, treacherous, unnatural, and blasphemous by the single monosyllable, Paine. Cobbett, in a way, Cobbett was a very unlikely adversary for Paine. They were both working-class immigrants from England. They were both appalled by social injustice. But while Paine concluded what we needed was more democracy, Cobbett concluded democracy had gone too far. He became editor of the leading Federalist newspaper, which was known as Porcupine's Gazette, though Paine called him Skunk. Their feud was part of the press wars of the time. Some of the nastiest feuds of the time were played out in the newspapers of the period. Cobbett and Paine were both popular, aggressive writers, and there was no pretense of objectivity in the newspapers of the time. They were openly partisan. The Federalists, in fact, tried, as I mentioned, to shut down the Republican press through the Sedition Act, but they failed. Essentially, the Republicans won the press war, but Paine was not among their winners. As I said, he was too radical for most Americans. His attack on Washington ended up damaging his own reputation more than Washington's. Even Jefferson, who was a fairly radical Democrat himself, ended up distancing himself from Paine. When Paine died in 1809, only 6 mourners attended his funeral. But here, too, there's another twist, and this is a weird twist. When Cobbett ended up returning to England, where he found himself disillusioned by what he saw. He found himself disillusioned by the inequality, by the corruption there, and he ended up jailed for sedition. At this point, Cobbett decided, Paine had been right after all about everything. This was Cobbett in 1815. He said, Paine observed very truly that a rich government made a poor people. And Cobbett committed himself to publishing Paine's work and to writing a biography of Paine, though he never finished it. But here's the weirdest part. So it was on a morning before dawn, early morning in 1819, Cobbett stumbled through the dark in a cemetery in New Rochelle, just outside of New York, and he dug up Paine's corpse. His plan was to take it to England because he wanted a suitable monument to Paine to be built in England. He took it to the customs, he got to the customs inspection in Liverpool. He announced to the customs inspector, there, gentlemen, are the mortal remains of the immortal Thomas Paine. Somehow he got it through customs. We don't know what happened to Paine's bones. To his son, we know Cobbett's son, J.P. Cobbett, inherited the bones in 1835, but no one knows where Paine's bones are today. Can I do one more? I promise to be short, but I can't talk about feuds and not talk about the duel between Burr and Hamilton. In a way, given how vitriolic these feuds were, it's surprising that more didn't lead to bloodshed, but blood there was. Most famously, on the morning of July 11th, 1804, when Hamilton, the former Treasury Secretary, faced off against Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States. Burr shot Hamilton, and Hamilton died the next day. One of the surprising things about the Burr-Hamilton relationship is that twice before, Burr actually saved, or may have saved, Hamilton's life. In 1776, when they were both soldiers during the Revolution, Hamilton was trapped behind British lines in Manhattan, and Burr, who was a New Yorker and knew his way around, led Hamilton to safety. In 1797, Burr headed off a duel between Hamilton and James Monroe. Hamilton was furious at Monroe. He suspected Monroe had leaked some documents about an affair Hamilton had had and a scandal tied to that. And Burr calmed the waters between the two, possibly again saving Hamilton's life. They were both lawyers, and they jointly represented a man who was charged with murdering his fiancée, and the jury found that man not guilty. What tore them apart was the 1800 election. Jefferson had selected Burr as his running mate in the hopes that Burr could deliver to the Republicans New York's electoral votes, which it did. At the time, though, the Constitution didn't distinguish between a vote for president and a vote for vice president. So even though Republicans voting for Burr and Jefferson thought they were voting for Jefferson for president and Burr for vice president, they both ended up tied with the same number of electoral votes. As a result, this threw the election into the House of Representatives to decide, and the House of Representatives at the time was still controlled by Federalists. And it was at this point that some Federalists began to wonder if they might be better off with Burr than they would be with Jefferson. After all, Burr was less tied. He wasn't as much of an ideologue. He wasn't tied to the Republican ideology. He was more open to compromise. He was from New York, not Virginia, which appealed to some. And he was ambitious, but he was ambitious more for himself than for his party. At this point, Hamilton stepped in and threw his weight behind his old enemy, Jefferson. Hamilton said Jefferson's principles were dangerous, but Burr had no principles at all. On Jefferson, he said, well, he has pretensions to character. As for Burr, he is bankrupt beyond redemption, except by the plunder of his country. His public principles have no other spring than his own aggrandizement. He is one of the most unprincipled men in the United States. Whether Burr actually, how close Burr came to being, how hard Burr tried to be president, how close he came to be president, still debated. How key Hamilton's opposition was in stopping Burr, also still subject to debate. But one thing is clear, and was clear then, Burr knew what Hamilton was doing, and he would not forget it, and he would not forgive it. And then in 1804, Hamilton did it again. At this point, Burr was running not for president, he was running for governor of New York. Jefferson wanted nothing more to do with Burr, and he threw him off the ticket. So Burr went back to New York. He ran for governor. Hamilton believed that Burr saw the governorship of New York just as a stepping stone to the northern states seceding with Burr as their president. And Hamilton again worked against Burr, and Burr again lost, and Burr again did not forget and forgive. What really brought the feud to a duel was a letter in a newspaper by a Charles Cooper, who was quoted about Hamilton's despicable opinion of Burr. Exactly what Hamilton may have said that Cooper was referring to is not clear. Some historians think he was referencing that a rumor that Burr was sleeping with his own daughter. But when Burr confronted Hamilton, Hamilton offered no explanation. He offered no denial, because basically, he did consider Burr despicable. So who won this feud, well, I mean, you can't say it was Hamilton. He was dead. But Burr certainly did not emerge unscathed. Dueling was already seen as sort of an aristocratic anachronism. Burr was indicted for murder. He ended up heading west, where gunfighting was more acceptable. And Burr is remembered today basically as Hamilton and Jefferson saw him, as an unprincipled opportunist. He was involved in various adventures that led ultimately to Jefferson making sure he was charged with treason. And he was an unprincipled opportunist, but perhaps today we should throw a little bit of appreciation Burr's way, because even if it was for his own ambition, he did try to appeal to both parties. He tried to appeal both to Federalists and to Republicans, even if it was to advance his own cause. And maybe there's some lesson there for our own ideological divides. In Burr's last days, according to a 19th century biographer, he was reading the novel Tristram Shandy. And this is a novel in which a character is tormented by a fly, and he lets it go. He catches it, and then he lets it go, saying, "This world is surely wide enough to hold both thee and me." And according to this biographer, among Burr's last words were, "I should have known that the world was wide enough for Hamilton and me." Thanks. I promise not too long. Are there any questions? Or?
In your studies of all of this, have you ever seen any references to what I have heard, which is that George Washington was against having political parties?
Well, yes. Most of the founders were against having political parties. That's one of the ironies of the fact that they feuded so much and created a party system. The founders, there's nothing in the Constitution. There's worry in the Constitution about a balance of power between the different branches of government. There's nothing about a balance of power between political parties. I think it's one of the great ironies of the age that they basically believe you should vote for the best man, the most virtuous man, and they thought parties or any sort of partisanship did not belong in America. It's one of the ironies of the founding era that these people who absolutely hated parties created a party system. Right, yeah. Not just Washington.
It was, and another thing it seems like is that, they were men, women were there, but they were men among men. They adopted the federal, all these parties and everything. But I think Washington knew that once you were elected president, you could be a leader of men. And he knew that parties would still be fighting with each other, and one man couldn't, put all that down. The other thing I want to ask you about, which I find both horrifying and amusing at the same time, is that the dueling pistols, didn't have rifle barrels. And I don't know who owned the dueling pistols, whether it was one or the other men, so they knew that this one shot that way and the other one was straight. But I'm curious about where the dueling pistols came from, whether they came from the Challenger, and they were really inaccurate, weapons.
I must admit I don't know where their dueling pistols came from. I do know there is much debate over whether Hamilton intentionally missed. There are many Hamilton partisans who believe Hamilton did not. The reason why Hamilton died was he intentionally missed. It's still debated, and but I'm afraid I don't know the answer to your question of where these pistols came from.
There was not necessarily a protocol of the guy challenging brought his own pistols or anything like that.
There may have been, but I'm not sure. If anyone else knows, please chip in. My ignorance is revealed.
With the popularity of Hamilton via the play and the descendant popularity of Jefferson, do you feel that it's warranted that he's portrayed as more of a snake than any of the other founding fathers at this point in time?
Well,
Or was he not that much different?
I would
Or was
say-
he that devious?
I would say it's warranted in one sense. Jefferson, it's not a coincidence that Jefferson was involved not in duels, but in many feuds himself. He feuded with a lot more than Hamilton. He feuded with a lot more than Adams. He feuded with John Randolph in his own party. He feuded with John Marshall as Supreme Court Justice. I think the dislike of Jefferson came from a number of factors. One, people did see him as a hypocrite even then because of talking about liberty while owning slaves. At least his opponents saw him that way. Two, he tried very much to act the role, and he was a brilliant man and a brilliant philosopher, but he took on the role of the philosopher who didn't play politics, but he let his underlings, like Madison or Monroe, play politics for him, and I think his enemies resented him for that. But I would say, for all the criticism of Jefferson then and now, and I'm not going to defend him as a slave owner, but I would say his words, "all men are created equal," did inspire future generations to free all men and also to move toward equality for women. So I don't mean to duck the question, but you can see why he was so detested by so many people. You can see why he was involved in feuds, and there was much to criticize him for. But I still think he made America better as a result of his words made America greater. I could say that about many of the founders.
The personal attacks that you spoke to, particularly in the beginning, how many of that, was that more public or was it more individual letters? I mean, how vicious publicly would it get?
It got pretty vicious publicly. I mean, some of it was private. Some of what I read was private. But as I said, the newspapers of the time were openly partisan. And so they didn't campaign the way we have campaigns now, that you weren't supposed to want to be president. You just had your followers push you forward. So a lot of it was private, but in newspapers, it was very public. I mean, it was, as I said when I talked about, certainly the Cobbett and Paine stuff was all in the newspapers, and Paine was unusual. The one thing that mostly wasn't public were any attacks on Washington. Washington was untouchable. He was the man both sides, at least in public, didn't criticize. That's why Paine's attack on Washington was so startling, because Washington, nobody was supposed to attack Washington, at least in public. But Paine was furious at Washington. Paine, I mentioned Paine ended up going, I don't know if I mentioned it, Paine ended up moving to France to support the French Revolution. And there he actually wasn't radical enough. The French, because he said, well, he came out against chopping off the head of the king. And so that left, for the radicals in France, that was unacceptable. So Paine ended up in jail. And Paine's fury at Washington was he felt Washington, who had been a friend, he felt Washington didn't do enough to get him out of jail. And that's what led to him talking about Washington being a treacherous friend.
One more question. Not so much a question as a statement. Just in the little bit I know about the Hamilton Burr duel, which is not a whole lot. The pistols in a duel, the weapon that is, usually the custom, and there was apparently some custom as to who get to do what, usually the weapon was chosen by the challenged party, usually. Now, it wasn't always the hard rule, but generally that's the way it worked. And I understand that the pistols used in the Hamilton-Burr duel were actually owned by Hamilton's brother-in-law, I believe. And one of the contentions is that the pistols had a hair trigger setting on them, of which Hamilton was not aware. So when he, and again, the argument is that when he brought the pistol down to bear, it fired prematurely. Burr, of course, was a little calmer in the incident. He'd been involved in duels before, so he went ahead and shot straight and true. Now, how much of that is true, we don't know, other than we knew the pistols. Apparently, I think last year they went on display in the Smithsonian or somewhere. The pistol used to shoot Hamilton went on display. But, yeah, usually it was a challenged party that got to choose a weapon. And most often
Which
they
makes
chose,
sense.
usually they chose swords. But, of course, you know, if you weren't a good swordsman, you choose something that may be a little more effective at a greater distance.
Thank you. Thank you all.